hope everyone's feeling refreshed after lunch. This panel is titled Data and Analytics for Acquisition, Retention, Engagement, and Re-engagement. All the buzzwords that everyone here loves to hear. So we have, and I'll start from right to left, but I'll let everyone also provide a brief intro of themselves. We have Geoff, Jack, Shachar, and Mika. Some great collective minds from the industry. So looking forward to you guys making this an exciting and insightful panel. Geoff, do you want to just quickly introduce?
Hi, so my name is Geoff Hamilton-Dick. I'm the head of Europe at Jamp. Jamp is a user acquisition and retargeting platform for apps. And our technology optimizes dynamically towards cost per action. So we're helping people to lower the cost of taxi bookings or first purchases, anything like that.
Hi everyone, I'm Jack and I am head of growth at Grabble at the moment. Grabble, for those that don't know, is kind of, in the simplest way, Tinder for fashion, but a little bit more content focused. And I used to be marketing manager for the UK, US and Australia at Happen. And also after that I was at Fever, which is a events app in London.
Hello, I'm Shachar Adin Shomrat. I'm the CMO of MyThings. MyThings is a web and app retargeting specialist. We've been founded in 2005, so we've been a while, over a decade now. We specialize in providing personalized retargeting solutions mainly for the travel, e-commerce, and content verticals, but also for mobile service providers.
Hi, I'm Mika and I'm the CEO at Bisbee. Bisbee is, I'll follow Jack's method of describing Grabble, so I'll say it's the Uber for home services. And so it's effectively a platform connecting users to home service providers, everything starting with plumbers, electricians, handyman, and all the other sexy services that we all need on a daily basis. Prior to that, I was head of data and analytics at Graze.com, which is a food retailer, hence my passion for data. Love it. Sexy.
Great. So when we all connected before the panel to discuss what would be the best way to get content that was most useful for the audience, we actually broke it down into 4 stages. So what we wanted to start with was discussing what some of the best practices for the use of data with regards to targeting and not just for installs and acquisitions, but also for retargeting your existing user base. So I think we'll just go right now from right to left. So Geoff, what would you say from your perspective would be some of the key things that an advertiser needs to take into account in order to really make sure that they get the most out of their acquisition and retargeting activities?
Yeah. So I'd probably say that any conversation about data collection start with 3 things, and those are all linked to setting up the events in your funnel, and something you really need to understand. So those 3 things, we firstly identifying the key event. Once you've done that, you need to sort of enrich that funnel with additional events, and then thirdly, you want to check the health of all that data, right, and make sure it's accurate and it's that you can trust the insights that you're drawing from. So that first point. So how do you establish your key event? What you want to look for is what's that thing that you need someone to do that's actually going to shift the needle within your business and it's going to help you to grow. So there's actually quite a lot of variance between app verticals. There's also some variance between the age of different apps. So to give you some examples, if you had just launched a social media app 3 months ago, I imagine that you will be far from any sort of path towards monetization. So a good sort of key event there that you might want to track is probably something to do with possibly there's a sharing function in the app, or maybe you've got the equivalent of a tweet or something like that. Now, conversely, if you imagine a scenario where you're dealing with a mature sort of e-commerce app, that's an easy one. You're going to be looking at the purchase event. You're probably going to be looking at the first purchase event, so you can work out your new customer acquisition cost. But then also imagine a scenario where you have a taxi app, right, but you're relatively new, as a hyper competitive vertical. And although you're monetizing, using the cost per first purchase and driving the first purchase is probably not actually that good an identifier of your app, because I imagine you're going to be using a discount coupon, right, in order to get people away from some of the bigger apps that are out there. So in that case, a second purchase might actually be the key event. So once you've established that, which is crucial, the second step that I mentioned is to then really try and fill out that funnel. So right now, if you imagine it, you've got a very short funnel, you're opening the app, and then we've identified this key event, and there's nothing in between. So you have no idea or no understanding of the intent of your users. Like, did someone come in and they came very, very close to achieving that key event, or did they just come in for a few seconds and they left the app? So what you want to do is just identify additional apps, additional events that you can track. To give you another explicit example with e-commerce app, it might be, for example, that you now start to track searches, that you look at product view, that you look at adding to cart, that you look at checkout. And then that will allow you to do two things. From a retargeting point of view, which I'm sure we'll get onto, that allows you to be much, much more granular in how you segment your users and how you go after them. From a user acquisition point of view, it now allows you to optimize even before you've hit that key event. Because if you see users out there who are opening the app and then they search, and then they add a product into their basket, and maybe they go to checkout but they don't check out, those types of users are pretty good. Like, there's a good probability that they will go on to monetize at some stage. So it allows you to make that call early on. And then the third and I guess the final point is the health of data. So it's really, really important that your data is healthy. Otherwise, you're going to draw all these insights, and some of them are not going to be correct. So what you want to look at here is make sure you've properly integrated the app with the likes of AppsFlyer, your attribution partner. And from there, really, there's probably like a couple of example tells I could give you if you've got unhealthy data. So the first would be if you have an event and the preceding event is mandatory. So let's imagine that to make a purchase in my app, you have to register. And what you're going to see is that 100% of your purchases should be registrants. And if they're not, then you've made, there's an issue somewhere in your data. And then the last point as well, and as an example of that, is if you see a single device ID, and from that single device ID you're getting a lot of events in a short amount of time, then again, it's probably too good to be true. So you should check your data, you should check your integration and make sure it all checks out.
Jack, Geoff just touched on the notion of, I think, like the magic moment at the beginning, where that's kind of the hook for the user. With Facebook, it was something like sending 7 friend requests within 10 days. Have you identified, or how have you gone about identifying that magic moment?
So we kind of have, but it's more not necessarily the magic moment. We just know the magic kind of event. So for our app, you can kind of swipe right on clothes if you like them and swipe left if you don't. And so we've kind of noticed that if you join the app and you swipe right as your first event, so you actually like the product you've just seen, you're like massively more likely to be retained than if you swipe left on your first event. So we've kind of been studying a lot into actually how many swipes does it take before they activate properly. So is it 10, is it 20, is it 50? And so yeah, we've kind of focused on that event, and that we did it exactly through the processes that Geoff mentioned, is looking at all of our event data and finding the actual, like the key common events that all of our active users shared. And for us, it was, high grab rate. Yeah.
Cool. Next, Shachar, just a quick question on the retargeting side. When you're engaging with advertisers, and obviously each app vertical is different and each app experience is different, what are you communicating to those people that is absolutely key for them to help you to deliver, in a sense, the best results on a retargeting side?
Sure. So first of all, it's important to identify those key events as mentioned before. However, I think that coming from a perspective that is more machine learning oriented. The more data that you provide, the more data you share with your app tracking providers and through them with providers of retargeting, for example, the better the results and optimization that you can get. So in a way, what's brilliant about machine learning, regardless of retargeting, is the fact that it basically, you feed in as many data points as you can, and you come up with the kind of optimization and model rules that will basically optimize your advertising activity. So the more data you share, the more you kind of open up and share those events with those app tracking and providers that you obviously trust in doing so, the better result that you would get. So in order to basically optimize the setup, in order to get the most out of your re-engagement and retargeting activities, I would first of all recommend to kind of verify that you are integrated with the latest SDK of your app tracking providers, such as AppsFlyer. But beyond that, it's to enable all these events from day one, and just make sure that through the app tracking platform, you either enable or disable any specific event. You can choose not to share any event, but just make sure that you have the infrastructure in place to be able to enable those events later on with any kind of provider that you want to share the data with. So thinking about it when embedding the SDK is crucial, because later on it may be much more difficult to change. So enable all events first time when installing the AppTracker SDK, and then later on in the platform decide which event you want to share with each provider, and this will give you the maximum flexibility. I think that these are my best tips.
I kind of actually right now wish that everyone had been a part of our pre-panel conversation, because this is where all the topics come out of, and it was very interesting. And you know, we discussed having to challenge preconceived ideas with regards to data. And I know, Mika, on that conversation you mentioned about usually how advertisers approach LTV, and that, you know, in a short-term perspective, it's not the best way to go around about things.
Yeah, actually, I mean, data is interesting, because actually you can take the very technical side of it and the very sort of machine learning perspective. You can get lost into the huge amounts of data that you have, and it's a challenge to implement a data-driven culture, as many companies tend to refer to it. And if you do try to do that within your company, you probably need to start at just simply identifying those key KPIs that you're going to track, and they need to be super, super simple. And in a startup, particularly when you start a company, I mean, you can try, I've heard so many people, and I've tried to do the same thing, you know, build my little DCF model to estimate lifetime value and to say that, you know, our user is worth £500. You don't really quite know that up until you get some real data. You know, after normally it takes about at least a years of data to actually understand the cohorts and to see what. So depending on the stage of the company that you're at, you know, you have to focus on the KPIs that are more realistic to measure. A, when you're a young company, you don't have a lot of resources. Your tech team is probably going to be quite small. There's no one going to be dedicated for data. B, you don't have a lot of people in the marketing team as well to be able to split every single hair and say, right, you got this campaign, drove, that CPA. So you're looking more, even though it's wrong to look just at averages, and it's right to look at the marginal user who you're bringing, what their LTV, what's their cost per acquisition. But you have to think at the right point, at the right, you know, in your journey. So the things that, you know, matter ultimately are, you know, particularly for an app, your cost per install, what is your conversion to registration, and then your conversion to purchase. So knowing those three metrics, ultimately, you know, your cost per converted user, and having some sort of idea of what would be your LTV and trying not to exceed technically, you know, it will be a 1-year payout ratio. But then again, it very much depends on your strategy as a company and whether you think that actually in the future there are going to be a lot of other revenue streams that you're going to monetize your users, so then you can be more generous about how much you're paying per user. So the idea was, you know, preconceived, sorry, just going back to the question.
Preconceived ideas. And so I think it was actually Jack that was mentioning more on the call. It was about challenging the notion of the data that's available in the market and it not necessarily being right to your specific business.
Absolutely, and I think, you know, that is right, and particularly from an acquisition perspective, people tell you what works for apps, for example, I think there was a time when everyone was just spending, if you made an app, you'd start advertising on Facebook and Twitter, and that was the sort of like, because that was the only place to get mobile inventory. But you need to test and see what works for you. Maybe, actually above the line, even though it seems that it's something that only the bigger brands do, maybe it's going to work better. So don't I found a book that I read recently quite useful, which is called, I actually just searched it to remind myself the name, Traction, How Any Startup Can Achieve Explosive Customer Growth. It's written by Gabriel Weinberg and Justin Mears, if anyone wants to make a note. It's a really good book and just simply goes through, 20 wide marketing channels that you could potentially test. And it's good to just do an exercise for every company and just say, right, actually, potentially for us, these 5 could work. So I'm going to go out there and test and see what gives a success. So again, I'm sort of trying to put data in a more commercial way, because it's very easy to just see it from what is data telling me? And actually a lot of it is, what is my common sense about my business and my commercial sense about my business telling me? And then using data to simply measure and understand and prove whether your hypothesis was right or not.
Are you doing something differently to challenge those preconceived ideas, or what's your approach from the app marketer side?
Generally, it's pretty much that. It's just, I completely agree. I think you often will get told by peers in the industry or by things you've read on the internet that this channel doesn't work for this type of app and this channel doesn't work for this type of business. And I would just challenge that and just test it yourself and then let the data do the talking and go from there, really.
So all the app marketers just have to have a total open mind and accept that what's working for one is not going to work for the other, and not to follow the crowd.
Especially even within like one vertical. So if it's a fashion app, for example, just because you see one of your competitors using a channel doesn't mean it's going to be a good channel for you. And equally, I think every app is completely different. Even if you think you're very close to a competitor in business model, you might not be.
But also go back to what Jeff said, and it was about question the data. Like, even if you're running a test and it tells you something, question your samples. Were they big enough? Just if it doesn't make sense, if it just doesn't make sense in your mind, you can't find a reason why it's right, then it's probably not right. It's garbage in, garbage out.
So in this massive ecosystem, and the job of a mobile marketer is not very easy, with so many things to take care of. We discussed some of the challenges that exist, and each one of us faces our different challenges. Something that touches on both app marketer and also retargeting partners is the amount of data that is being passed or shared with various partners. And then we can go from static events to what are called rich events, where there's increased metadata. Geoff, how do you really engage with advertisers to enable them or really drive them to share those extra data points that will enable you to retarget someone based on adding an item to a shopping cart, for example?
Yep. So just to make sure everyone knows what a metadata is as well. So that is basically a sort of more granular level of data that you're passing in the click. So if you had like a hotel app and you had a content view event in there, then when that event is triggered, you're not just seeing that I'm looking at a hotel. You can actually see the specific hotel that I'm looking at, and you can see how much it costs and so forth. So you can imagine that type of data is going to empower your marketing strategy, whether it's retargeting or user acquisition. I think for us, in terms of getting advertisers to part with that data, it's actually something that's got much, much easier. What we learned really early on is just with a very sort of open arms is to kind of show people actually what you can do for them before you've signed any kind of contract or there's any sort of obligation to work together. So it's pretty easy. So typically the way that we do it, by the way, is we would switch on sort of all attributed data through a partner like AppsFly, and we just look at that data for 7 days, and we get our data science team to pour over it. And what they're doing is that sort of really rich funnel that I was talking to you about at the start. They're analysing that to understand, where is the retention, the drop-off, where is it occurring in the funnel, how big are the segments, and so forth. And from that, you can actually go out and you can build a really, really cool plan that kind of tells them, exactly the types of things that you could do, and you can sort of use that as a dialogue. I don't think you need to be dictatorial in terms of what you think is going to happen, but you can see if that information if it supports their BI efforts internally. And I think that makes it really, really compelling, right? Because then suddenly that marketing manager has got something that they can probably print out. They can probably take it to that leadership meeting where someone's just kind of working at action at a distance saying, look, we don't share our data. And they can actually really support the claim for why it's important and how it's going to help the bottom line.
And sticking on the retargeting side, because I'm sure that a lot of people here aren't just looking at solely an app property, but also on the website. And again, referring our call, but Shachar did reference cross-device attribution and tracking and assigning of proper credits to each of those channels. How are you approaching with advertisers that are either seeing two properties as separate entities or wanting to track cross-device from web to mobile?
Sure. So obviously a large portion of our client base is actually desktop moving into the app space and not necessarily mobile first. And therefore there are many different scenarios where they can interact with and re-engage with users across devices. It can be desktop through mobile web and then back into the mobile web, or potentially app through other app inventory and back to their apps, and many different other scenarios. And the point is that it's still an industry challenge, first of all, to do the cross-device matching. Even the retargeting across devices is still a challenge, and you base that both on a combination of probabilistic and deterministic manners of identifications of users across devices. So that's first challenge. And the second challenge is attribution, because the industry, it's so new and it's so emerging that the industry still is not, even within the same device, multi-attribution is still considered to be a challenge. Now, by adding the additional dimension of also cross-device, so different users, they've seen an impression on desktop, then they converted on within an app. And then the question is, how do you attribute those activities to different providers playing in the different devices? That's still an industry challenge. It's not yet solved. And obviously, it's in a way, it's an obstacle to providing these robust cross-device solutions, because in order to be able to truly invest in re-engaging with users across devices, you need to be attributed and compensated for activities and impressions and media costs that happened and occurred throughout the different devices. So that's clearly a challenge, but I expect as the industry matures, as the methodology becomes much more prevalent, it will be to some extent handled better, but it's still a long way to go.
So I have a question.
Sure.
How do you deal with offline, like when we're talking about above the line, TV advertising, tube advertising, particularly because as we see more and more apps advertising, whether it's Whiteplan, whether it's WhatsApp, sorry, not WhatsApp, I meant TaskRabbit, Green, sorry. So, yeah.
So specifically MyThings is not providing these offline services, but we are focused mainly on display advertising. But our client base is basically finding ways to attribute conversions across different channels. It's a challenge, yes, it is. So there is no specific solution, textbook solution for this challenge that you've mentioned. There's no...
From the tracking side, it is possible for the offline. It is possible to use certain trackable points to be able to attribute a download. So if it's in an underground station, for example, then if there's a QR code on the poster, then it can, of course, help, or a promo code or something. A lot of brands don't like to use QR codes for various reasons, but there are ways, and it's just a question of, at the end of the day, what an advertiser wants to do and how exactly they want to drill down into the data, which from an advert leads me perfectly onto the next point, which was we discussed the mass amount of data that basically an advertiser is suddenly receiving from all app marketing activities, and it can lead to what we refer to as analysis paralysis. How are, specifically from the advertiser side, how are you both approaching really being able to ingest and digest the data and not get lost in all those numbers that are there?
Gentlemen first.
So I think a lot depends on the size of your team, but from my point of view, when I first started at Grabble, I was a one-man growth team, and now I have 5 people in my team, so it's obviously a very different story. What I would say is, and this kind of goes back to best practices a little bit, but it's kind of setting up a reporting for you that works for you and so choosing the key metrics and things like that, but keeping it very simplified and keeping it in a way which is not too time consuming. Having said that though, I think what's a really good way to actually make sure that you are continuing to track your data and actually analyze stuff is if you try and automate everything too quickly, because it all becomes automated, you can very quickly just stop checking your reportings or just doing it when it suits you. Whereas if you actually leave some of your reporting to be done manually every single day, it actually makes you go and look at your metrics every single day. And in that kind of way, if you do that in a well-balanced way, where you're not just paralysing yourself every morning, coming into the office, spending 2 hours filling out your reportings, and then you can do it in, let's say 15 minutes, that 15 minutes is really well spent each day, and then you actually can go and use that insight every single day to optimise what you're doing. So I think it depends entirely on the size of your team, because when I was a one-man team, that's exactly what I had to do, was the reporting manually every single day. And as my team grew out and we got a data scientist, she was able to help me create more automated reportings, and by that point as well, I was much more comfortable with our metrics and much more comfortable with the areas of the business that I was worried about and the areas of the business I wasn't as worried about. So I think it does depend entirely on the size of your team and the stage of your understanding of your own data. But yeah, definitely encourage people to never actually make things 100% automated, because you will probably end up getting lazy and sloppy with data.
Can I just ask, in terms of the audience, what company size are we talking about? Like, what proportion, if we can do a hands raise of people who are here in companies smaller than 20 people? That's quite a good proportion. The one thing that I'd add to that, because actually that's exactly, I think we're on the same page. It also depends on the technology that you have. So, for example, at Grays, we had our databases were SQL databases, which made it a lot easier, even in the absence of a data warehouse. We could query the operational databases directly. And actually, most analytical tools, if you look at Tableau or any other data visualization tool, talk better to a SQL database. Bisbee, because it is an app, and actually because of the operational needs, operationally we have a Mongo database, so it's a NoSQL database. Makes it a lot harder in terms of analytics. You don't have, naturally, if you don't have a developer dedicated to building a data warehouse, which is in some sort of a SQL form, then you're a bit screwed, because you actually need to learn some sort of JavaScript and to try to query it. So actually what we've implemented was Mixpanel, and Mixpanel is our data warehouse, more or less, so we rely on that heavily. Regardless of what it is, whether you're doing queries or whether you're using some sort of analytical tool, I think to the point that Jack was making, just establish what are the 3 key reports, or few metrics that you want to look on a daily basis or on a weekly basis, and have that routine of looking at them and understand. Actually, they change over time. So that sort of avoids, but again, back to the point of analysis paralysis, there's a point where you build a data-driven culture to the point where people just wait for the data to give them the answer, and they won't make a decision unless, what does the data tell us? And then your data team becomes effectively your bottleneck. And I've been in that position to the point that I was, I got quite aggressive with the guys and said, right, okay, so use your brains and make your decision, because ultimately data will only confirm or affirm, what a hypothesis is. And sometimes, if, going back to what I said earlier, if you don't do a test properly, or if you don't have big samples, sometimes it's just not even worth testing. It's just worth making a decision, moving on with it, and that's it. The simpler you keep it, particularly at initial levels, I think the better it is. Yes, and then you want to store as much data as possible early on, because ultimately you'll look back and you'll want to run your random forest model or build your neural net or whatever it is that your data scientists will do, and you'll want as much data as possible, but making sure, going back to the data is collected in a very clean way. But in terms of what you're looking at when you're analyzing initially, yeah, very simple.
Sorry, just to jump in as well, I think an obvious solution, if you have these types of bottlenecks, is you can outsource to a marketing partner. And I think that gives you the ability to obviously then leverage more resource, so just more hands on deck, expertise, and people who focus solely on that one task that you're trying to do. But above all else, technology that you're not going to have access to that's been specifically developed for these tasks at hand. And that's going to certainly help you to lubricate that situation to get better results.
So one of the other challenges that we discussed, and is something that I hope not many of you are experiencing, is the increasing role of fraud in the mobile ad space. Something that all of us in the ecosystem need to be wary about on some level. How is it impacting, if at all, your approach, both from an ad partner side and also from an advertiser side when you're looking at all those metrics?
So from my side, I mean, like most people in this room, whoever is an app marketer, I'd be very surprised if we did a show of hands, like who hasn't suffered from fraud at some stage. And I think those who think they haven't suffered, they possibly have, and they don't even know about it. So I'd say the biggest issue at the moment is that by the time you discover fraud, it's actually too late. Right? You may have even paid for it, but the damage of the fraud is already prevalent in the app. So I think what we're trying to do there is just get smarter and smarter at trying to predict it and understand it. So there are patterns in fraud. We've certainly got better at identifying those and building machine learning to help us understand them. It doesn't entirely solve the problem, because fraudsters, obviously, by nature, they're trying to stay one step ahead of those types of technology. And I actually think that this year, I think part of the solution will hopefully come from the attribution partners to work and try and get there as soon as possible and help to identify it, help from a commercial point of view as well, whether you're actually having to pay for that fraudulent traffic.
Anyone else? No?
Just want to address that there are 3 levels or layers of anti-fraud and brand safety measures that can be taken. It can be so in our case it includes internal proprietary sort of algorithms that try to predict those fraudulent patterns. But on top of that, obviously there are third-party providers that provide an additional layer, and also the app inventory provide yet another. So it's about layering, and as Jeff mentioned, nothing is 100% proof. Fraud-proof, but it's definitely about layering different measures of anti-fraud techniques in order to minimize the risk.
Well, I'm just going to say it is a challenge, and actually, if there's anyone in the audience that provides solutions as a product to that, please, I'd love to talk to you guys, because I think. Oh, great.
So and we have about 10 minutes left, and I'd like to open it up to questions afterwards. Hopefully we'll have some questions from the audience. But my favorite question when engaging with partners from the ecosystem is what excites you about the coming year? I know it's a very open-ended one, but would love to hear your thoughts, and I'm sure I hope everyone here would like to as well.
Shall I jump in first for that? Sure. Yeah. So I guess, so we're pretty excited at the moment about dynamic product ads. I don't know if that just doesn't sound at all interesting to anyone else. So what dynamic product ads allow you to do, so if you think about your retargeting capabilities, they allow you then, so based on some granular segmentation where you really understand who you're talking to, maybe this is someone, and we've built a segment of people who have purchased in your app, and they maybe now haven't purchased for 28 days, they're lapsed, and the data shows us that these guys should, on average, have purchased, say, after 10 days. Then what we can do is, using metadata that's being passed back to us, you can actually go out and you could go and show that person an ad built around maybe their last search or their last product view. Perhaps they abandoned their checkout and they had a £8,000 plasma screen in there, right? So DPA allows you then to go and show that person the ad for that exact product. With one click, as long as you have deep linking in the app, it can take you straight into the app. It's very frictionless, and it can allow you to go and make that purchase. So what we see from DPA, I mean, we've been running tests for the last sort of 6 months now, conversion rates are just astronomical. You're reaching people with the exact product, you're reaching them at a really good time, and it's very, very relevant. And for us, we think it's going to be a great way to continue to drive conversion on retargeting.
Jack, also.
I think from my point of view, it's quite a boring one, but I'm actually just excited to see the development of all of the analytics platforms and the kind of CRM provider that we use, and all. Just generally the industry as a whole, I don't think is very mature, and I think all of the providers out there, I don't think there's any one provider particularly that's nailing exactly what they're doing. So there's providers like Mixpanel that try and offer everything, and other providers like AppBoy, which are much more focused on CRM, for example. And I don't think any of the platforms are perfect yet. So there's a lot of stuff in all of the pipelines of our suppliers, of other suppliers that we might be working with in the future. I'm looking forward to a time when basically the platforms I use are actually on a par with kind of things like Facebook, for example, which obviously are much bigger companies, but getting some actual analytics platforms and some CRM and things like that actually in place, which are much less kind of a hassle, would be my big priority this year. I think aside from that, from a marketing perspective, I just think the marketplace is developing kind of in a really exciting way right now. We've got Facebook talking about a messenger bot coming up. Snapchat is kind of opening up a lot more. I think Pinterest has just opened up to the UK and for advertising. So there's basically a lot of social channels which have previously not really been open to advertisers. They're kind of slowly starting to develop, and I think this year in particular looks pretty exciting for that. And yeah, that's pretty much it from me.
Daniel, I feel like you need to defend yourself there.
Yeah.
No, but on some level, I can connect with Jack because on a day-to-day basis, when you're sat looking through data and handling all the things, sometimes the smallest feature release from anyone can really excite you.
Yeah.
And the market is still maturing and people are becoming more savvy. I don't think I need to really defend myself, but we're delivering value that no one else can deliver. But we'll leave that conversation for later on.
I just want to expand a bit. So dynamic product ads have been part of personalized retargeting, at least on web, for the past 10 years. So it's exciting, but I'm excited that it now is now becoming part of the app ecosystem as well. What excites me is the next step, which is tying into CRM platforms, such as the ones that Jack is now beginning to implement. For example, the likes of Urban Airship or Optimove, I think it was mentioned earlier today. So the kind of data mining and personalization platforms that basically provide, identify patterns and segments, and then basically tying those with your display advertising. In essence, it's a bit like direct marketing over banners or an extension of push notification onto advertising channel. But what you get is completely seamless communication with your consumer. So whatever information you have in your database can be applied to tailor and personalize the messages that you show that segment on advertising. And obviously that increases optimization, it increases relevancy and personalization. And for me, that's exciting. It's quite advanced both in web and in app, but we do see the most savvy kind of retailers or advertisers on desktop as well as in app now adopting this, and it's very exciting.
That's hard. I'll agree with Jack in terms of the integration of different platforms. So, I'd be interested to know, well, I guess I'll just say from a business perspective, we use at least 5 software to manage our analytics and marketing and tracking and customer and provider interaction because we're a marketplace. So actually we keep on saying that if there was a solution that would combine Customer.io, Intercom, Mixpanel, and AppsFlyer into one, we'd be the happiest chap in town or girl in town. So
you're looking for a one-stop shop, whereas Jack is looking for the specialist.
I think there's...
Well...
it's the compromise that you have, right? Because if you go for a solution that handles everything, then you know that you're not going to get the best from that thing and the best from that thing.
But at the same time, every time you hire a new person, you need to train them on 5 different things.
But also my point was that even the companies that are just focusing on one element, I don't think any of them are nailing their own element anyway. They're just doing...
AppsFlyer.
They're just doing...
I don't think he said AppsFlyer. Didn't mention.
No, I just think that there's a lot of room for improvement in all of them just because the industry isn't very mature. And I think if we'd got to the stage where already every single platform was perfect, then would be amazing. But I think we're just so early on.
We wouldn't have panels like this.
We wouldn't have panels.
No.
But I just think there's a lot of room for improvement across the board, whether you do go for an all-in-one approach or whether you go for each area of expertise, like specific. That was my main point.
Okay. And then the only other thing was if there was to be a Salesforce solution to be able to query your NoSQL database with SQL syntax, which, having looked for it, there seem to be tons, but not actually that is something easy. So if anyone has ideas of that or has discovered something I haven't, then that would be great.
Do we have time for questions? Yeah? Great. Anyone? Well, firstly, anyone have a question?
Just one question around attribution and cannibalization. We didn't speak about that, which is quite surprising because retargeting and cannibalization go together hand in hand. Very simple question, multi-touch point attribution. And I'm going to, if you have a specific example. So so we are driving downloads through TV and retargeting is working really well. The pain is how do you divide that single sale and how you attribute just towards those two touch points that you're converting it. And then the cannibalization issue is because, last click model, it works very well at top level. How, do you have any specific examples how companies are dealing with the cannibalization issue?
Shall I address the cannibalization? So for us, we see that challenge that probably most of or some of the networks, certainly that you're buying inventory from, not many of them really have exclusive traffic. So effectively, when you go out and you buy from multiple partners, you're actually therefore cross-bidding for a lot of inventory. Our solution to that is very simple, by the way. It's like we try and work on an exclusive basis with our partners where effectively we go out and we do that buying for them, and that will allow you to go out and control the CPI. You can therefore really inhibit the amount of cross-bidding that's happening, and you can really try and tackle that problem before it even occurs.
Just from the attribution side, for the last few years, it has been about last click, and to some extent it still is, because that last click is the one that delivers the conversion. Not to use this as a selling platform, but we do have what is called multi-touch attribution, and it is enabling advertisers to have that top-down view of how their spend is performing. So a user got exposed to a Google ad, they clicked, they didn't download, and then a Facebook ad, they clicked, they didn't download, and then a Twitter ad. We're enabling them to know that user journey on the road to conversion. And so even if an ad network isn't delivering that conversion, it still can be very valuable in exposing the app and exposing the brand on that road to the user eventually converting. And that is something that advertisers do want and must have access to.
Is there any way you distribute the sales, so that 70% or the 50% goes to the first touch point? I'm just even talking about simple touch point between TV and display retargeting. How do you just divide the sale? Is there any sort of rule there without, because smaller companies like DoubleClick and AppsFlyer, there is a monthly rate also, and it's when you look at the cost of implementing the solution and the ROI that you're getting out from there. So, are there any?
I think that those are two separate subjects. So the cost of the solution or implementing the solution is the benefit of having access to that data and knowing which channels are generating the ROI and the downloads. With regards to the multi-touch side, and what you're referring to is basically assigning a weighted credit to each. I don't think that the industry is there yet. That's definitely the direction it's going, and that's how people are talking and wanting to kind of see if they can have access to that data. It's a challenge in and of itself. You've got to really know how you're assigning those credits. Time of day, time from click to launch, all those parameters, and there's a lot more that come into play. We'll get there, but I think generally the mobile marketing industry is. We're all very impatient to get everything right now, and it's still a very new industry, and it's maturing. And as people become more savvy, the tools become more savvy, the data points become more savvy, and we're definitely going to get there.
And additionally, you see some models used in the desktop, for example. I would expect some of them to be apparent also in the mobile as the industry matured. But it still varies considerably between advertisers. As for cannibalization, some of our clients found it helpful to run some kind of incrementality test, where they basically use a control and test group, and then they basically test and measure the uplift of exposed and unexposed, and then they realize the additional impact of retargeting, for example, and they get convinced that it's not cannibalizing anything or basically bringing back users that would have come in.
Yeah, so on cannibalization as well, I mean, one thing you need to be careful of is obviously cannibalizing the natural conversion that was going to occur, right? So the way that you want to do that, that's all about data. So very much that's a data-driven decision where if you look at a particular segment and you need to understand, you know, how soon should we be retargeting them, and what's the latest that we could retarget them, you're going to get all of that from proper data insights.